Hey, Bethany. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. And when you were out in the waiting room, could you see my chat or no?
No, all I saw was just it said you'll be let into the meeting shortly.
Okay. Interesting. Um, then I guess I'm just gonna try out some functionality. When you entered, you were muted, right? I'll try out
Yeah.
some functionality with you, and then I'll just start letting people in and put the slide up.
Okay, yeah, because you can. Yeah, I'm not promoted to co-host right now, so you
Oh,
can mess around with my camera.
okay. So let me mute all, allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay, I have that option. Um, and I can mute and unmute. I think that's the main things is that I can mute and unmute and mute all at once. I don't think anything else seems super critical.
Okay.
And for so you guys were going to do the plan, I think, is that then after the presentation, we can take questions and people can put in the chat just their names and I can unmute them individually to ask their question.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Or
Cool.
if they want, they can just chat it and you
Mhm.
can ask us the question
Okay.
if that's easier for people.
Yeah, I'll offer both.
Okay.
Cool. And I'll do that after the presentation's over.
Awesome.
Great. I know that, here, first I'll make you a co-host. Actually, would you be willing to share your screen before Marielle gets here?
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you want me to put up like the first slide?
I think the first slide says the meeting begins at 3, so
Yes, it does.
yeah.
Okay. There we go. You should be able to see it.
Perfect. And let me see, original size. Oops. Okay, I'm glad we did this because now I can't. Uh-oh.
What's going on?
Oh, I found it. When it went full screen, I couldn't admit people again.
Oh,
And let me
yeah.
see if I mute you now that you're a co-host, if you mute. Okay, you do. So,
But I have the power to unmute myself, and I don't think other people have that.
oh, here, I think you do. But now if I uncheck this, do you still have the power to unmute yourself?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Then I'm going to let everybody in.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool.
We should try to be quiet on this line so we can talk on Teams if we need to.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've got about 3 minutes till 3. So just hang tight and we should be ready to go very soon. Right. It is officially 3 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the mix-up. But you're all here now. Hurrah! Hello. Thank you all for attending. Um, my name is Marielle Pinheiro, and I am a research data specialist with the Office of Research, Planning, and Performance with the State Water Board. Today, I, along with my colleagues Scott Coffin and Bethany Robinson, will be presenting results from the COVID-19 drinking water survey that was conducted during November. So today we are going to present an overview of the process that was implemented to design, distribute, and analyze the survey. Please note that presentation is mainly focused on the methodology, not the results. Before we get started, quick housekeeping note, please. I believe that we have everybody. I believe that we have everybody muted. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll go through them after we finished all the slides. Otherwise, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Ooh. Oh, okay. Next one. All right. So when the executive order was issued in April, this involved a moratorium on service shutoffs. So in anticipation of the inevitable financial impacts, the board initiated voluntary surveys for drinking water and wastewater systems back in June. While we did get some useful information from this initial effort, it was not a representative sample and it didn't contain enough responses to be statistically significant. So therefore, in November, the board initiated a second survey effort, which took place in November, ended in the beginning of December, and then we did a whole bunch of analysis and presented preliminary findings to the board just yesterday. So the video is online. I believe the recordings are available on YouTube, as well as the board website, but we'll put links up. The data and the report are also available. The personally identifiable information from the data set was removed. That was one of the stipulations for collecting the data. But yeah, we'll put the links in the chat. Yes, I see. Great. Okay, so there were 2 surveys issued, one for surveys with less than 10,000 service connections, which we will refer to going forward as the small system survey, and then another which was for systems with more than 10,000 service connections, which we're going to be referring to as the large system survey. The small system survey logistics were managed by Division of Drinking Water staff. They notified systems that had been selected to participate via email and then followed up by phone over the next couple of weeks. Whereas the large system survey was issued directly to system administrative contacts via email, and we held a workshop on November 18th to provide guidance for filling the survey out. The survey collected a mix of quantitative and qualitative responses. Some question areas were similar between the 2 surveys. All respondents were asked to provide information on numbers of accounts with debt and levels of debt associated with those accounts, as well as more refined breakdown of delinquent account numbers by zip code and by the amount of the delinquency. But there were other additional questions asked for the individual surveys. The small survey asked a lot more questions about the financial health of the system. The large system survey asked questions about some of the fee and repayment options and drinking water debt specifically. All data was collected on Excel-based forms with data validation on the response areas to ensure that the data we collected was in the right format. The individual responses were extracted from the individual spreadsheets using Python libraries and aggregated into separate tables for the small and large survey questions. The zip code responses were combined into a single table, and all of that's available online. All right, I will now pass the mic to Scott to explain some of the statistical procedures that were used in the data analysis.
Thank you, Marielle. So before surveying the systems with less than 10,000 service connections, we wanted to ensure that we were not over or under sampling from any parts of the distribution. And so the first thing we did was we looked at the distribution of water systems based on service connections. And you can see here, this is the total number, or all of the water systems in the state, some histograms that are binned based on the fee code color, you can see here. And we used a method called Jenks natural breaks to determine the natural breaks, as you will, or the different distributions within this larger distribution that have the smallest variance. So this was important in designing our survey to, again, ensure that we are pulling representative samples from this non-normal distribution. So we essentially tried to create normal distributions within this larger distribution. And the breaks are shown here at 1,008 service connections, 3,090, 5,868, and then again at 10,000. We can go to the next slide, please. So the breakdown in terms of where we set the breaks really coincides with the fee code designation for the break between small and large systems. And this was not intentional, this was actually incidental, and it just turns out that the distributions of these systems actually tend to follow our fee code designations. And so we had 4 strata that we designed our survey around. We call them bins. Here we have bin A, you can see it was almost entirely made up of community smalls and disadvantaged small systems. The other 3 bins were made up of these disadvantaged and community large systems. Again, this was just a way to determine to make sure that we're sampling properly within this larger distribution. Next slide, please. For this, I'm going to hand it over to Bethany.
So here we're showing the margin of error for the 4 different bins that Scott just talked about. And because the margin of error is based off of the standard deviation, which is related very heavily to variance, we see that there's actually very small margins of error for these bins. And you can tell when we sample most of them, for instance, in bin D, we sampled 55 of the 72 systems in the population. Our margin of error was only 1.2 and 1.4 for the 90% confidence interval and 95% confidence interval, respectively. It's a little bit higher for bin A because there are more systems in bin A, so 1.5% and 1.7%. And these were all based off of the population and the sample size. Go ahead, next slide.
Thanks, Bethany. So the general workflow for analyzing the data after we receive the responses is first to examine the missingness of the data. Not all of the questions that we asked in the survey were responded to by all of the systems. And for cases that we didn't have auxiliary information, essentially information that is not collected by the survey but is useful for understanding demographic information. This includes median household income, Cal-Enviro screen scores, we know all service connections, but these sort of parameters might have been missing for certain systems and can be incredibly useful for steps down the road. So the first step was to determine the missingness of the data and decide how we're going to handle that. We could either remove all of the survey cases that were not complete, which in some cases may actually dramatically reduce the power of our survey because we'd be throwing out a large portion of the samples. And in this case, we actually decided to impute the missing data, and we'll talk about that in a second. After we have filled in our missing data, then we calculated base weights, which is literally the fraction of samples within the population. So if we sampled half the population, every sample would have a weight of 2. You multiply that sample by 2 to extrapolate to the statewide. We then further adjusted these weights for non-response because not all of the samples in our list responded. Not all of the surveyed systems responded. So this is an additional adjustment. And then of course, the final adjustment is calibrating to these auxiliary variables that I mentioned earlier, such as median household income, fee code, some other variables that I'll mention in a bit. Next slide, please. So the concept of weighting is quite a very simple analogy would be if you sampled 50% of water systems in the state and you sampled them all as a perfectly representative sample and everyone responded, then in order to get a total estimate of debt, you would just multiply the values by 2. You sampled half, multiply by 2, now you have 100%. In practice, it's a lot more complicated than that, but the equation is actually incredibly simple. And in this case, for statewide extrapolation, you can see the total here on the left is determined by the sum of each weight multiplied by the respective response value. And you can do that for any of the response variables that we have. I'll talk a little bit about the debt, which is one of our main response values. So next slide, please. So now that we understand sort of the steps, I'll talk again about this data incompleteness, which is our first step in analyzing the survey data. So listed on the right here are the questions that we asked. These are, the cash reserve. What's your unrestricted cash reserve, restricted cash reserve? What's your total cash reserve? How many months could you go before assistance is needed? What's your delinquent number of accounts, delinquent amount of dollars? And these questions were not all of them were answered by all respondents. And the lighter the color, the higher percentage of systems that actually responded in our survey set. So, for delinquent number of accounts, we had between 91 and 96% of respondents answered that question. But for some things like restricted cash flow, restricted cash reserve, we had as little as 37% of survey respondents that actually answered that question. It turns out that for bin A, which is these very small systems, this is just due to accounting. They didn't have that level of granularity for their data, in which case we made a new variable called cash reserve aggregate, where we essentially turned the missing data into zeros. We interpreted them to be zeros. But you can see here, there's actually a lot more variables considered that we examined for completeness and incompleteness. And we determined that it would be best to impute the data using statistical means. So I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So the concept of imputation is based on trends that you find for other variables. Can you estimate other variables? So the simplest case is cash reserve. Systems with unrestricted cash reserve are going to, the value for that is going to be proportional to the total cash reserve. And it just so happens that it's extremely predictable, actually. When you think of scales of economy, it makes a lot of sense. So here's just an XY plot of the log 10 unrestricted versus total cash reserve. You can see there's some deviations from a straight line here, but overall, imputing data from this trend would be more or less reliable. Now, we took a far more sophisticated approach than just doing a linear extrapolation. And since we're working with many variables here, sometimes like 10 or 15 that we're imputing at one time, we ended up using a machine learning algorithm to do the work for us. Next slide, please. So this imputation was done through something called a random forest modeling. And effectively what this is you could think of a decision tree where your first step would be whatever classification or whatever variable you have. So are service connections greater than 5,000 or not? Yes or no, go to the next step. And each time you reach a next point in the decision tree, you are basing your decision off of what variables you have available with the best predictive variable for whatever your response is. In this case, we're looking at the CalEnviro screen score, 2019 July expenses, for example, median 12-month household income. And so we built these trees, these decision trees for each of these variables many times, about 500 times. And then we use the composite of all of these decision trees to get the best answer and smooth out any type of inferences that may not be useful to us. And the way of checking whether or not our imputations are reliable and if they make sense is by plotting the imputed data in red over the observed data in blue. And you can see here that our imputations more or less followed the trend of how these data actually look in our real data set. So we moved forward with the data that we imputed well, and we did not use the variables that didn't impute well. There were just a couple. Next slide, please. So now that we have a rather full data set, the next thing is to start weighting the samples. We've already calculated our base weights. We know exactly the proportion of samples within our population that we have data for. Now, the next step is to consider response rate. Although our staff did a fantastic job of reaching out to systems by phone, by email, and collecting information, we still were unable to get full responses from our sampling list. And it turns out there were some trends in the types of systems that responded and those that didn't. And you can see just from a macroscopic view, just looking by the bins that we had, the strata, bin A had a lower response rate overall than bin D. And we did some further analyses, and we did find some statistically significant predictors of whether or not a sample would respond to the survey. And this implies that this is not a random effect, and that that we have to actually correct for this non-random effect, predictable non-random effect. So Next slide, please. One way that you could visually predict the response just conceptually is to plot the median 12-month household income on the x-axis against the non-response weight, or the response prediction of these systems. You can see it's not linear. This was not the only predictor that we used for predicting the response, but it's one of many that we use in our machine learning model to, again, do the work for us and figure out different propensity classes for response. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier the random forest using decision trees. This is an example of a decision tree. At the first step, it's asking, are the number of service connections for this water system below 15, and in this case, it's log 15, yes or no. And then you go down into the bin at the very bottom, being the bin of the expected response propensity. So that is now a new weight adjuster that you multiply by your base weight. And then you can continue down on the decision tree until every water system is binned into this non-response or response weight. And we iterated this 500 times to, again, smooth out any inferences from any particular one tree. And so we had a forest of trees doing the work for us. Next slide. So this left us with 4 discrete predicted response propensity bins for both the less than 10,000 systems and the greater than 10,000 systems. And you can see here that the predicted response propensity was actually quite tight for each of these bins. There were some outliers, but overall, this approach seemed quite reasonable. So we moved forward and adjusted our weights using this method. Next slide. So now that we've imputed our data, filled in all of our missing data, and corrected for the non-response issue, the next step is to ask if our survey data set is representative of the population. We already took great steps in the beginning to design our survey so that we're sampling from strata in a way that could be that should be best representative of the state. But we can do further adjustments to improve this stratification, and this is called post-stratification. We're applying another layer to the survey, and this is showing the distribution of samples by median 12-month household income. You can see that the population, which is in yellow, it follows a somewhat normal-looking distribution, and our sampled distribution in pink doesn't quite match what you would expect to find if you were perfectly randomly sampled the population. So we essentially coerced that distribution to look exactly like the population by further adjusting these weights, again, using an iterative approach. Next slide, please. So this leaves us with this weighting. And for all of the statewide estimates that you saw yesterday, and we'll see in the report and see in today, we use these final weights that we calculated to estimate the totals. These can also be used to estimate means and other summary statistics. Next slide, please. So just to show the impact of weighting, the slide was showed yesterday, the error bars really shrink when you stratify and post-stratify the data based on these different auxiliary parameters that we calculated and the response weights. The other thing that you'll see here between the red and the green is the effect of imputation. So I mentioned that working with incomplete data for a survey set can underestimate the total, because essentially you're throwing out samples that don't have data. So when we imputed the data, we did find slightly higher estimates of total estimated delinquent US dollars or debt for these large systems. And this holds for the small systems as well. And so you can see here both the impact of the imputation and the weighting. Next slide. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Bridget.
Hi, y'all. So I did this qualitative analysis, and in doing it, I created a coding schematic. So I tagged comments based on common categories of responses. And so some of the common ones that we saw were staff time limitations, billing software limitations, mentions of SB 998 and the shutoff moratorium, and then there were some other ones as well. And this qualitative analysis allowed us to more effectively categorize the narrative data that was given to us as part of the survey, because we wanted to include that as well.
So the zip code data analysis was done in collaboration with UCLA. We do have a couple of folks from there that are on the call, so they will be able to provide further context on the specifics of the analysis if those questions come up. There were differing levels of data completeness from this information. Some systems only provided totals, not debt amount breakdowns per zip code because of limitations in the billing software. Some zip codes are serviced by different systems, multiple systems, and some systems provide further breakdown by single family and multifamily. So, you know, if you were just kind of looking at the data, you'd see that there were multiple entries per zip code, and so you kind of got to do a little bit of data manipulation before it's ready to go. But once we did, then we were able to connect demographic data to that information, and that data comes from the 5-year American Community Survey data, which provides a lot of useful information. So things like race, age, income, the zip code population, and a lot more. So with so much information to work with, we, you know, it's easy to get lost in the data, but we do have kind of a couple of big overarching questions that we're looking at. And one of them is which systems are most immediately financially vulnerable in the short term. And to that end, we used a few variables to calculate some metrics for assessing the level of vulnerability per system. So the 3 metrics used here are the perceived months before assistance, which was a self-reported multiple choice question, which asked how many months the system thought that they could hang on before they would need to apply for loans or whatever. The days of unrestricted cash variable is the reported unrestricted cash reserve at the time the survey was taken, divided by estimated daily expenses for the report period. And then finally, the revenue to expense ratio was the total reported revenue divided by the total reported expenses. So these rows at the bottom here are that are highlighted in red are the factors that would indicate that a system was high risk according to each of these metrics. So once we had the 3, then we were able to go through and calculate a final score just based on the count of how many high risk metrics there were. So systems with 2 out of 3 high risk indicators have high financial vulnerability, and systems with 3 out of 3 have extreme financial vulnerability.
So we've talked a little bit about the qualitative data, and now I'm going to walk through an exploration of the quantitative data that we have. So when we look at revenue, because we collected monthly revenue and expenses from the systems, when we look at revenue losses relative to 2019, and again, we only looked at 7 months of data, April to October, so this is not a full year view. But what we saw in those 7 months is that quite a few of the systems actually have revenue increases. So on the bottom, the x-axis here, we see the revenue losses in percent. So below 0% is going to be a revenue increase. And then we see them from 0 to 25%, all the way up to 75 to 100%. And then we have the percent of systems on the y-axis. The blue systems are the survey sample, and then the green systems are the statewide estimate based off of the weights that Scott talked about. So we expect 69% of systems in the state to have actually had revenue increases of any amount, even if it's $1 more, it's an increase. From 0 to 25% is the next largest bunch. We see that we estimate 17% of systems statewide had revenue losses in this category. And then we see very few systems from 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, and a little bit of a jump over in the 75 to 100% category. We estimate 8%. And from what we saw in the survey sample, some of those systems have had big capital expenses that have put them in that category. They're not normal, but other systems didn't have any kind of qualifiers in their comments. Next slide. Here we are looking at a very similar graph of the expense increases for 2020 relative to 2019. And this is still that same time period I was talking about. We see, again, the largest category is actually an expense decrease. 49% of systems statewide are expected to have expense decreases. And this could be on purpose. This could be because systems knew that they would need to cut down on their expenses to maintain their income flow. And the next largest category is the 0 to 25%, where we see almost a third of systems having expense increases in this category. And then the 25 to 50% category is 11% of systems. Then very few again in the 50 to 75 and the 75 to 100. And then we estimate about 10% in the 100% or more expense increases. Next slide. So when we translate this monthly data and we look at it in differences in net income, I'm going to start on the graph on the left, we see that it looks a bit like spaghetti, and there's a lot going on here. One thing to tease out of this graph is that all of the smaller systems, the blue, fewer service connection systems, are all right along that x-axis, which is because they're usually dealing with smaller amounts of money than the larger systems. So that makes sense. And it's hard to see what's happening with each of these systems. When we move on to the graph on the right, this is showing the percent change in net income from 2019 to 2020 by service connection. And we're seeing that the y-axis is the percent change from the previous year. Now, a lot of the systems hover around the x-axis here, and some have actually higher net incomes this year than last year, but we do see that there are a lot of systems below the x-axis, and that there are quite a few of them very far below, which is worrying from a water system management perspective, that they've had such drastic changes from last year to this year. Next slide. Looking at the cash reserves, we see on the left the cash reserve funds, both the unrestricted and the total, in blue and red combined by this black line between them. Service connections are again on the x-axis and dollars are on the y-axis. Very few of the very small systems answered with the unrestricted reserve values. So a lot of these toward the lower end of the service connection values are just going to be red dots by themselves. And we can see that as we move up to higher service connections, there are much larger amounts of cash reserves. Some of you may have noticed what looks like exactly the same cash reserves for two of the systems in the upper left-hand corner, and that those cash reserves are much larger than the other systems of similar service connections. And these two systems in particular are actually managed by the same company, so they share cash reserves. They are both small systems, but they have a bigger management company, which allows them access to more resources. So that was an interesting thing that we found out during this survey. And if we look at the cash reserves as a percent of average monthly expenses, we can see that quite a few of the very small systems have very large reserves compared to their monthly expenses, which is a good thing. And that this, although as we move down on the service connections and we get to larger service connections, we see that they start to lift off of that zero line a little bit, very imperceptibly. But in general, because they're dealing with such larger monthly expenses, they don't have larger cash reserves as a percent of their monthly expenses. Next slide. So what we wanted to do is see which of these variables we've been talking about could predict when a system would need assistance. So again, a random forest machine learning algorithm was used for this analysis. I used 10,000 trees, and I again fit all of the variables to a system that just looked at whether they could predict looked at whether they could predict how many months before these systems said that they needed assistance. So it's the 0 to 3 months, the 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12, or more than 12 months. And what we see here is that median household income and service connections are the two variables that are most able to do this together. And so on this plot, we have service connections and median household income plotted together. And the color of each dot for each system is how many months before they need assistance. They have reported that they need assistance. And so with these hotter colors, the red and orange and yellow that say that they need assistance sooner, we do see those in the left and bottom parts of the graph, showing that the fewer service connections and lower median household income correspond to this. But we do have some outliers. We do see that service connection systems that are closer to 10,000 have also reported that they would need help within 6 months. And we have seen systems that have very high median household incomes that have also reported this. Next slide.
So we're only getting started with this analysis. The initial findings that were presented to the board are just a small fraction of the total available data. So we're going to continue to further explore the significant factors that lead to high delinquency or debt, which is going to include a deeper exploration of the zip code demographics. Additionally, we're planning to refine the vulnerability score methodology. There's been some discussion of looking at municipalities versus privately owned systems. The initial findings do indicate that there are some systems that are already at immediate risk. January is 3 months out from the time that we stopped collecting the data. And we've already followed up with the systems that indicated that they would require financial assistance within that time frame. However, there were 18 systems that self-reported needing financial assistance in the next 6 months, which is approaching. So we will be following up with those as well. So this last slide, it just provides the link to where you can find the report and the data. Additionally, this email is the contact information for any follow-up questions you might have. So I suppose with that, we're going to now start looking at any questions that were posted in the chat. And yeah, how do we want to do this?
If anybody has questions, they can either directly write the question in the chat and I can read it out loud for people. Or if you'd prefer to present your question yourself, you can just write your name in the chat and I'll invite you to unmute and you can ask your question.
Was it too much math? Okay.
I think let's go in order. So I'm going to invite Ryan to speak.
Hi, think you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I know that you started off by saying that you weren't taking questions on the results. So I don't know exactly how to ask this question, but it's related to the total amount of debt as characterized as being related to water. So in the water board's frequently asked question, they say that, or you all say that the total amount of debt is somewhere in the range of $600 or $700 million as related to water. So I was curious how that number was arrived at, what the process was there. And yeah, if you could walk me through that, that would be much appreciated. My apologies for sort of asking an open-ended question, but what would be particularly helpful is how the total amount of debt in the Excel file that you made available relates to the drinking water related debt in the Excel file that you provided, which I read as columns O and R, if that helps with your ability to answer the question.
Right. So first of all, the drinking water specific question was only asked in the large system survey. And that question was not always answered, and there were a number of reasons for that. Some of that has to kind of do with, aforementioned difficulties with billing. Some systems just didn't really have a good idea of what the breakdown would be because they just, combine their bill for everything, electricity, water, wastewater. So we did have to make kind of some educated guesses. Additionally, if they provided a total but not a specific drinking water portion, sometimes we were able to make a reasonable assumption that it was all drinking water related, but it's and additionally, we did do some imputation with some of that with for some of the drinking water related data. So that previous section of the presentation where we sort of filled in missing values, that's where some of that comes from. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I guess then my follow-up question would be, is there a way that you could share the imputation process there and any of that, like much like you've provided on some of this other data?
I'll defer to Scott on that part.
Sure. So the report that we have online lists the methodology for how we imputed the data. And we need to update the CSV file that's online to annotate the base weights, or sorry, the final weights. And we'll also make sure that the imputed cells are there. I think they might be already, but if not, we'll make sure that that's up within this week, so you can see how our imputations may have changed the results. Just looking overall at lots of different analyses of the imputation, it didn't change the averages virtually at all. The distributions of the data look almost exactly the same before and after imputation. It just really helps when estimating totals.
Great, thanks. And then I think Max mentioned yesterday at the water board presentation that percentage statewide of the total debt was roughly 60% was attributed to water. So is that, because I didn't see that repeated anywhere, I just happened to catch that from Max's comments. Is that fair? Is that number 60% of total debt is related to water? Sorry to put you on the spot there. Happy to take when answering an email if you don't remember off the top of your head.
I remember that number 2. I would have to say stay tuned because, like I said, like this analysis is very preliminary. We had 2 holidays sort of interfere with the process, so we've still got a lot of work to do.
The 60% I would say is a rough estimate, because a lot of looking at the comments from the water systems that responded for that, they said that either they didn't report any or they weren't sure, and so I would take the 60% with some big error bars.
Okay, I will read the next question that is from Timothy Guster. And this asks, can you please describe how the water board and the CPUC are coordinating their efforts?
And Marielle, I don't want to interrupt, but I think that Max has a comment on that on the last section that I'd like to allow him to say, and then we can get to Timothy's question.
Sure.
And I can respond to that second question as well. So yeah, just to add to what Scott Mariel said on the drinking water only portion, that's our best estimate based on the analysis we were able to do. we have a lot of confidence in the overall debt estimate. We have less confidence in that 600 million drinking water only estimate. However, it's based on the data we had and based on the work we did, that's what we wanted to share publicly, because we didn't want to say we don't have any estimate. But it doesn't mean that that number might not change somewhat. But I think it's safe to say it's in the ballpark, that roughly 60% of the total of the total debt is drinking water specific. There are a number of large systems that provide multiple services. DWP in particular provides multiple services on a bill. So a large portion of DWP bills, which are 10% of the state, have drinking water as a lesser percentage. And of course, there are other large systems that provide water and power, water and wastewater. There are also a lot of large systems that are drinking water only, particularly the investor-owned systems in the state, the large ones. So it's our best estimate at this point based on what we have. It's just one we have less confidence about than most of the other numbers, for reasons that people went through. So let me turn to the second question now, which is, I believe Tim Guster, is about coordination with the Public Utilities Commission. So generally what I'll say about that is we have been coordinating with the Public Utilities Commission. We are meeting with the Public Utilities Commission on a frequent and regular basis. They started collecting data from investor-owned water utilities earlier, but what we were able to do is take a statewide look, add in the zip code level analysis, and I anticipate that the PUC will be looking at our statewide analysis in terms of how they think about the proceedings they have open right now for the utilities that they regulate. So Tim, I don't know if that is the answer you're looking for, but that's sort of how we're coordinating with the PUC.
Okay, the next question is from Kristen Sales, who says, is it possible to get a custom report for a specific zip code that tells you whether the zip code is low risk or high risk, or what their score is?
It unfortunately would probably be pretty difficult, because the data that was used to calculate those scores was the system level data, not the zip code level data. And especially with the systems that service multiple zip codes, we wouldn't know how to sort of do a breakdown of, like if one zip code is more financially vulnerable than the other. Also, there's that whole thing about, certain zip codes being serviced by multiple systems. So I would say it's easier to assess the risk using the system level data, not the zip code data. But, who knows what'll turn up once we do more with the sort of the demographic analysis.
Great. And then Cindy Tuck asks, did you do any initial analysis without inputting data?
I'll take this one. So we did quite a bit. There's some things that you can do without needing to impute data, trends, looking at summary statistics like averages and quartiles. You really don't need to impute the data. The only time that the imputation was critical was looking at totals, because in that case, if you are missing a value, you're simply subtracting it from the total, and we didn't want to throw out any cases for that.
We also have Gregory Pierce here. He from UCLA. He has something to add to that as well. So if you're able to unmute him.
Hey everyone. I just wanted to add that we did look at many of the same, variables that the water board looked at to produce its estimates based on what you just heard without imputing, and the results were very, very similar. So again, I can just say that to lend confidence that the imputation did not skew the results in an improper way. And we did that completely independent of what staff just described.
Great, and then I'm going to ask Brian Sanders to unmute to ask their question.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. So appreciate you having this workshop and kind of going through these explainers. You know, the data that was requested was not the easiest to obtain from our systems, especially with such a short turnaround, but we did manage to make the timeline, or the deadline, I should say. However, I do have to apologize because, you know, upon further analysis of the data that we submitted after it was submitted, we found some pretty big errors. And so just kind of wondering what moving forward, how we can go about ensuring that the public facing global data is updated when errors are found so that it's as accurate as possible. And then kind of along those lines, as well as for any related data collected in the future.
Yeah, so I'm the one who manages the data. And I would say, you know, just contact me directly. Well, I guess you can just send it to the email that's up on the screen and I will receive that email. It's actually fairly trivial for me to update anything that you think might be an error. Tweaking the weights might take some more work, but you know, we'll probably like hold off on doing any sort of complicated calculations until you know, we know that people need to, you know, make any changes. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I can make any adjustments as necessary.
Okay, and Darcy Bostick asks, what level of ACS data was used for the demographic analysis? Block group, census tract, place, etc.
I might ask one of the UCLA folks to answer that if possible.
Yeah, is Peter available?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we used zip code level data from the ACS. We had a data set and we were able to match that directly with the zip code debt data in the survey.
Okay, and then Abdallah asks if they missed the first 10 minutes of the presentation, if there's a recording of this event.
We did record this presentation and we'll be posting it on our YouTube account after this.
That's all the questions that I'm seeing at this time. Maybe we'll see another minute if anyone has any remaining questions.
Okay. Well, that was easy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for attending. And if you participated in our survey, we really appreciate your cooperation with us. And we look forward to presenting additional analyses. And again, if you have any more questions, please feel free to follow up with us. Send an email to the email listed here.
Yeah, and I have to say, as the person who had to put all the data together, it was very nicely, you know, like there were not that many errors that I could see. So thank you for that, because it makes my life so much easier.
Alrighty, with that, I think we can conclude the meeting. Thanks all for coming.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.